So twice a year, long-distance migrating birds make this insane journey where they head south for the winter and head north for the breeding season, or the spring and summer. There are, though, misconceptions about that. For instance, not everybody goes north. Not everybody migrates. There's a lot of misconceptions and myths, and some of them are really old, some are kind of funny, and so that's what this episode is about. I'm going to talk about the myth or the misconception or the assumption that we might have, and then the reality and the truth behind it. The first myth is an old one. I don't think anybody believes this anymore, but it's one I came across while researching purple martins, and that's back in the 1800s or so, people believed that purple martins didn't migrate. Instead, they believed that they hibernated, and in order to hibernate, they buried themselves in the mud for the winter. And Stan Tequila also mentions this in his bird migration book. So I don't think it was just purple martins that they believed this. I think it was, birds started to disappear, and the assumption was that they were burying themselves in mud. The reason this may have come about is that certain species of swallows built their nest out of mud. And so cliff swallows and barn swallows use mud nests. And so it would make sense that after the nesting season, they're disappearing, we don't see them anymore, and they make their nest out of mud. So why wouldn't they bury themselves in the mud? But I think most of us know that this is not true at all. The next fun one, and this is really cute to imagine, and I thought that this was an older myth too, but then I was at a hummingbird banding event recently, and I heard a guy ask the bander, hey, okay, I heard this. Is this an old wives' tale where hummingbirds hitch rides on the back of geese in order to migrate south? And of course, the hummingbird bander was like, no, that isn't true. But let's look at why that isn't true. Well, number one, it seems like, like that would make a lot of sense. It would be adorable, and hummingbirds are so little. So to envision them traveling 1,000 miles to head south is just insane. So it makes sense. Why wouldn't you travel on the backs of geese? But no, hummingbirds leg it all on their own. And the other big thing is that geese, Canadian geese, aren't even going the same place as our hummingbirds when they're flying south. Not all of them are migratory. Some of them living in the United States, they have no reason to leave. But the ones in Canada, when they're traveling south, a lot of times they're just coming to the States. And some Canadian geese will get into the southern states and even into Mexico. But when we look at the hummingbirds range and where they're migrating to, they're going down to Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula. Some may wait out the winter in southern areas of Mexico, but they're going a lot further south than the geese are. I think a lot of us also assume when we're thinking about migratory birds, we're thinking they're all going south for the winter. But with migration, that isn't exactly always true. There are long-distance migrators, so our swallows, cliff swallows, tree swallows, barn swallows, they are going south. Our ruby-throated hummingbirds, they're going south for the winter. But there are some species that are migrating based on altitude. So they're going from a higher altitude to a lower altitude and back again. Or there are partial migrators. Bluebirds are an example of partial migrators, and not all populations of bluebirds migrate either. The ones in the very northern regions may. It depends on resource availability and things like that. But when they do migrate, they're partial migrators. They're not migrating the long distances, going way south like our swallows and ruby-throated hummingbirds. They're going south of where they are now. And that brings me into something else. South is kind of relative. So for us, south may mean south of us, but for birds living in Alaska, south is where we are if we're in the lower 48 states. Dark-eyed juncos and white-throated sparrows are great examples of birds that are traveling south, but they're traveling south to us in the lower 48 states. On that note, another thing that a lot of us think when we're thinking about migrating birds is that when birds migrate south, they're going to the tropics. And I really like this idea. I would love to migrate to the tropics and probably never migrate back. But that, as you're learning, that isn't the case for all birds. Some are going to states south of where they originated from. Our own observations can lend themselves to some myths and assumptions, and one of those examples is migrating flocks. So it's easy to think that all birds, when they're migrating, will migrate in flocks. And number one, we've seen it with murmurations, we've seen it with geese in their V formation, but that's not true for all species of birds. The ruby-throated hummingbird is a great example. I know I keep going back to it, but it is a great example of a solo migrator, a bird that migrates on its own. It may be in proximity with other migrating hummingbirds because they're on the same route, but they're not intentionally migrating in flocks. I will say it would be really neat if we saw a flock of migrating hummingbirds, but that's just not how it works. The next misconception that I hear people kind of reference is that migration seems like this kind of continuous journey. So when a bird is migrating, they're going and maybe they're stopping for the night and they pick up the next day and they go again and it's on and on and on until they hit their destination. But sometimes what happens is they find a good spot and they'll use that time to build up their fat stores again, to refuel, to rest. So something that's important on this topic is this idea of a stopover site. A lot of times this can be a nature center or a bird station or even a park with good habitat, but your own backyard, if it's set up really good, can be somewhat of a stopover site for different birds that are rolling through. So what I mean by a stopover site is I use the analogy of a rest stop, or if you were on a long car ride and you needed to stay at a hotel overnight. So you're stopping over. Well, that's kind of how it works for birds. A stopover site is a place where birds are able to recharge, refuel, and a lot of times it has that habitat that they need. You can make your own backyard a bit of a stopover site, and I have a video on how to help migrating hummingbirds, and it kind of talks more about that. So planting native plants, keeping fresh water available. There's a lot more tips in there, so definitely check that video out. Sometimes in the late summer, early fall, I start hearing people ask, hey, have the hummingbirds left? When are the hummingbirds leaving? And the same happens in the spring. Have the hummingbirds come back? When did they come back? And this brings me to my next misconception, and that's that a lot of us think that birds of the same species migrate at the same time. And again, this can be true for certain species, but not all species. Ruby-throated hummingbirds are a great example where the males usually take off first, and the females, and this is for the southern trip, but the females and the juveniles will spend a little more time in their breeding site. The juveniles are strengthening their wings and they're building up their fat stores, and then they take off later. The other thing on this is that just because you're a hummingbird and maybe you're a male hummingbird doesn't mean, hey, we're all going to go on Monday and we're all going to take off. From one bird to the next, they may take off at different times. And some of that has to do with how much weight that they put on. So I read a study where they were at a bird station and they were observing hummingbirds down in Louisiana. So they were observing hummingbirds before they were crossing the Gulf. But what they found is that they weren't taking off until they hit about a certain weight, and then they'd start to take off. And so that can be a big determining factor. It's definitely within a certain time frame, but again, just because you're a male hummingbird doesn't mean all you guys are all going at the same time. I would encourage you to really watch your feeders and make those observations. Is there more activity happening, or is there suddenly activity tapering off, and when does it, and is it the males versus the females? And the reason this is fun to observe is it's one thing to hear it from me and it's one thing to read it on the internet. It's another thing to see it for yourself. And it is so cool when you get to see these things for yourself, because you're observing this in real time, and it's, I don't know, it's really cool. It kind of links you to nature. You get to see it for yourself. The next misconception that I have on my list here is that when birds migrate, especially for the winter migration in particular, is that they're doing it to avoid the cold. That's the motivation. That's the reason for migration. And this makes sense. Again, I would happily migrate to the tropics. I would also not return. And I would happily avoid the winter and enjoy the summer and the good weather and the sunshine all year round. But this is not the driver for birds. For birds, a lot of the motivation for migration has to do with resource availability. During the winter, or actually before the winter, so late summer and early fall, Food is the primary resource. But during the spring, it's habitat, it's breeding territory, breeding availability and selection. And so they end up going to their breeding sites and finding their territory. Some are resuming their old territory, but resources are the big driver for migration. So the next misconception, and this is something that I believed as a kid, you know, I was taught that birds fly south for the winter, and I was taught that they fly south because, you know, who the heck wants to stay for the bitter cold? And so the assumption then is that they know to migrate because of the change in the weather. So this is a misconception that I think a lot of us have, is that the change in weather signals migration. However, I'm wondering if you've been left with the same question that I was, where there would be like an early cold snap in the fall or a really warm snap in the winter. And when weather is so unpredictable and temperature is so unpredictable, so how is it that birds know based on weather and temperature? That just doesn't seem like a good way to go about it, because from one week to the next, they could end up in a bad storm, or they could end up, you know, freezing. What scientists have figured out is that it's photoperiod that triggers migration. And what I mean by photoperiod is the amount of light in a day. So as we get closer to winter, the days get shorter. And then by the winter solstice, it's like dark at 4 o'clock and it's miserable. So that's where photoperiod comes into play. And the cool thing is that photoperiod, the amount of light in a given day, is something very constant, something that is predictable, and birds can use that without trouble. And that makes me feel a lot better, because I can't predict the weather very well. Meteorologists, they do their best, but it's still really hard. So yeah, the sun, way more constant. The next misconception that some people have is that if you leave your feeders up in the winter, you could delay migration. And I think that this is a bigger concern with hummingbirds. People are afraid if they leave their hummingbird feeders out, will that prevent hummingbirds from migrating, and then would they end up freezing during the winter time? And this is not true. You don't have to worry. You leave your feeders up, and the great thing is that you're feeding incoming migrating birds, you're feeding your residential birds, but the drive to migrate, especially with our long distance migrators, is so strong. That instinct rules over the food availability and everything like that. If you're one who has been feeding hummingbirds for years and years and years, then you probably know that there's increased activity around migration time, and then it starts to taper off. And it's not about how many hummingbird feeders you have out, or if you've left them out long, or anything like that. The other thing I'd say, especially with hummingbirds, is that sometimes something can happen to a migrating hummingbird. Maybe an injury, maybe sickness, maybe they didn't get their fat stores built up enough, or maybe they were knocked off course. And so what happens is their migration is somewhat delayed, and they're kind of like a straggler as a result. So leaving your feeders out during the winter, or at least later in the season, can really help the survival of maybe a straggler hummingbird. If you ever find one of the best things you can do is get a feeder out there, make sure it's thawed, make sure you keep it fresh, and that right there can help give it a better chance of survival. Their bodies are really good at converting sugar into fat, or excess sugar into fat, and as long as they have good fat stores, they may have a better chance of survival. I have a video about why hummingbirds don't get diabetes with all the sugar that they consume. And it kind of goes into more detail about how insane and amazing their metabolism is, and how good they are at converting the sugar into fat and everything. So you may want to check that out, because it's just fascinating. Hummingbirds especially are just really fascinating. There are a lot more myths about migration than what I have on this list, but I think that these are some of the common ones. In the end, whether it's a partial migrator, a long distance migrator, one that's coming down from the mountains, or a residential bird that hangs out all winter long, it's hard to be a bird. It's hard to survive in nature. And so one of the best things we can do is we can level up our backyard birding. That's what this whole channel is about. So if you're interested in really good stewardship and providing for native wild birds, definitely consider subscribing, because you'll learn all about proper care and things that we sometimes do without proper education that can have negative consequences. So if you really want to build a habitat for birds and really help our songbirds thrive, and keep watching, there's a lot of easy things that you can do in your backyard to help the native songbirds thrive, and some of them are on a decline. So doing what you can really contribute to, you know, the overall environment and your local ecosystem and everything.